I didn't notice the suitcase at first. I walked past it twice in the hallway, distracted by a half-boiled kettle and the echo of my husband's voice from the garden, where he was trying to replant the same hydrangea bush for the third time that week. The third time I passed by, I paused. His son's name was scribbled in permanent marker on the worn handle. I stood there for a second, holding my breath, the kettle screaming in the background like an impatient reminder that something was about to boil over. He arrived that afternoon without much ceremony, just a quiet knock on the door and a lowered gaze. He'd grown up, his shoulders broader, jaw sharper, but still had that same cautious way of entering a room, as if he didn't want to disturb the air. My husband greeted him warmly, with that quiet paternal pride that was more habit than affection. They hugged, exchanged some words about traffic and weather, and just like that, we had a guest for an undefined amount of time. He took the upstairs guest room, the one across from ours. I didn't realize how much I noticed the sound of footsteps overhead until then. The creaking floorboards became a sort of Morse code. I began to guess his movements, trace his rhythm. Mornings started with the smell of his cologne, faint but deliberate, trailing down the staircase before I ever saw him. It was not intrusive, but it lingered, like a question never asked out loud. The first few days passed as one would expect. Polite conversation over dinner, light mentions of work and plans, the clinking of forks against ceramic. My husband beamed, happy to have him home. I smiled when expected, laughed when prompted, filled wine glasses out of habit. But something shifted in me when I saw him watching me. Not staring, just holding his gaze longer than necessary. It wasn't hungry or inappropriate. It was observant, quiet. And it made me feel seen in a way that felt dangerously good. It happened the fourth evening. I'd just finished showering. The house was unusually quiet. I stepped into the hallway wrapped in a towel, thinking no one was home but me. I was adjusting the fabric at my chest when I saw him at the top of the stairs. He'd just come in from the back porch. Our eyes locked. There was no sharp intake of breath, no dramatic gasp. Just stillness. His gaze dropped momentarily, my bare shoulders, the wet strands of my hair sticking to my neck, and then met my eyes again. I should have turned, fled to the bedroom, pretended I hadn't seen him. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there for a moment too long. After that, I began to pay attention to the way I dressed, even in the house. A fitted blouse instead of the usual loose one. Lip balm with a hint of tint. A silk robe I hadn't worn in years. I told myself I was simply enjoying the feeling of self-care again, but I wasn't foolish enough to believe that. He was polite, always. But it was in the politeness that I felt the heat. When he handed me a cup of coffee and our fingers brushed, there was no accident in the duration of that touch. When I leaned over the sink and he passed behind me, his hand rested on the counter next to mine, just a little too close. We said nothing. We acted like the air between us wasn't thickening. My husband noticed none of it. He talked about installing new shelves in the garage, about refinancing the mortgage, about calling his cousin in Florida. He didn't notice how I flinched when he touched my waist or how I turned my face slightly when he kissed my cheek. It wasn't malice. It was absence. He went to bed early most nights. I stayed downstairs longer, pretending to tidy the kitchen, to check emails, to scroll endlessly through irrelevant news. But really, I stayed for the silence, the kind that he sometimes shared with me from the opposite end of the room. His book open but unread, his glance catching mine through the reflection in the kitchen window. I began to memorize him in pieces. The way his hands looked when he stirred his tea, the slope of his neck when he leaned forward, the slight furrow between his brows when he was lost in thought. These weren't things I was supposed to notice. And yet, they became the most vivid parts of my day. One evening, I reached for a dropped spoon, and our hands collided. My pulse kicked against my ribs. He paused, his hands still under mine, and looked at me, not with desire, but with something deeper. Recognition, maybe. I didn't move my hand. He didn't move his. And just like that, something cracked in the quiet structure of our home. I started dreaming again. Vivid, unsettling dreams that left me breathless in the morning. Sometimes they were just shadows and warmth. Sometimes they were more. I'd wake up next to my husband, his back to me, his breathing steady, and feel like I was floating between two realities. One that felt safe, and one that felt alive. Wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't planning betrayal. But what had started as a glance was turning into something more difficult to ignore. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a slow burn underneath everything. And I could feel the smoke in my chest. He rarely spoke much at dinner, but that night he asked if I needed help with the dishes. I agreed, a little too quickly. We stood shoulder to shoulder, passing plates, avoiding eye contact like school children. His hand grazed mine when he reached for the sponge, and my breath caught. Later, as I folded laundry in our bedroom, I stared at the mirror across from the bed. I touched the hollow of my throat. My reflection didn't look back with guilt. It looked back with hunger. And I knew this was only the beginning. It was raining the next morning. Not a dramatic downpour. Just that persistent, whispering kind of drizzle that clings to windows and settles into your bones. I stood by the glass door in the kitchen, watching the droplets race each other to the bottom pane, my fingertips wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. He was behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it. I could sense his presence now, the way you feel static before lightning. There was a shift in the air, something subtle but unmistakable. He didn't say anything at first, just walked in quietly, barefoot, wearing a gray t-shirt that clung to his chest in a way that made me acutely aware of my own breathing. The silence between us had taken on a new kind of density. Not uncomfortable, just full. "Coffee?" I asked, finally turning toward him. He nodded. "Thanks." I poured it slowly, my hands steady despite the churn inside me. When I handed him the mug, our fingers touched. Again. This time, he didn't move away. And neither did I. It wasn't long, but it was long enough to change the texture of the moment. I saw the way his eyes lingered on mine. Not searching, not questioning, but registering. As if we both knew we had crossed some invisible threshold. We stood there, facing each other, the table between us now feeling more like a suggestion than a barrier. He took a sip. I looked at his hand, the veins along his wrist. The way he held the cup like it had weight beyond ceramic. "You look tired," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I didn't sleep well," I replied too quickly. "Bad dreams?" "Just strange ones." He nodded as if he understood more than I'd said. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and opened the back door, walking into the misty morning like he needed air. I waited a beat, then followed. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want him to be alone out there. Maybe I didn't want to be alone in here. The garden looked different in the rain. Softer, like everything had blurred at the edges. He stood near the hydrangea bush my husband had been obsessed with all week. Arms crossed, shoulders slightly hunched. I stopped beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Did you always like the rain?" I asked. He glanced at me. It's honest. Doesn't pretend to be anything else. I smiled, surprised by his answer. That's rare. We stood in silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. And then he turned toward me just slightly, enough for our shoulders to brush. "You don't look happy here," he said. Not accusatory, just quietly observant. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how, because it wasn't that I was unhappy. My husband was kind, stable. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He never raised his voice. We shared a rhythm, comfortable, predictable. But that was the problem. I had become a shadow moving through well-lit rooms, smiling out of muscle memory. "I'm not unhappy," I said finally. "I just feel invisible sometimes." He looked at me for a long time. "You're not." I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. Maybe it was the rain, the quiet garden, the impossible closeness of our thoughts. All I know is that suddenly, his hand was at my waist. Light, like a question. My breath hitched, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't forceful. It was slow and careful, like we were afraid of breaking something delicate. I felt his breath mix with mine, the dampness of his shirt against my skin, the hesitation in his fingers as they hovered, then settled more firmly on my back. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. When we pulled apart, the silence returned, thick and charged. I looked away first, staring out at the rain as if it could explain what had just happened. He stepped back, just a fraction, and said, "I'm sorry." But I shook my head. "Don't be." We didn't say anything else. We just stood there, letting the rain soak into our sleeves, our thoughts louder than the weather. Later, I dried my hair in the bathroom with trembling hands. I looked at my reflection and waited for the guilt. It didn't come. Not in the way I expected. There was confusion, yes, and a nod of something that resembled fear. But guilt? What I felt was clarity. For the first time in what felt like years, I'd touched something real, something electric, something mine. I dressed slowly, a pale blouse, soft at the collar, a lace bra I hadn't worn in months, though no one would see it. I didn't do it for him. Or maybe I did. I wasn't sure anymore where the lines were. That evening, my husband rubbed my shoulders while we watched a documentary. His hands were warm, practiced. I closed my eyes and tried to feel something. I tried to let the tenderness reach the parts of me that had once longed for it. But all I felt was distance. A kindness without fire. I kissed him goodnight out of habit. He smiled. I lay beside him, our bodies separated by a few inches of mattress and a lifetime of familiarity. My heart, however, was downstairs on the back porch, caught in the rain. And I knew, without needing confirmation, that what had happened that morning was not the end. It wasn't even the middle. It was the first ripple of something deeper. Something neither of us was ready to name, but both of us had already chosen. The day after the kiss unfolded like any other, on the surface. My husband, ever the enthusiast for practicality, woke early to compile a list of home repairs he wanted to tackle before summer truly arrived. I heard the soft shuffle of his slippers down the hallway, his voice murmuring to himself about hinges and mulch and extension cords. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, as if the grain in the plaster could offer answers I hadn't yet found the questions for. My body still held the memory of that morning in the rain. Not in the dramatic way romance novels tend to exaggerate, but in subtle betrayals. How I lingered at the mirror, how I traced my bottom lip with a finger, recalling the weight of his breath, the heat of his palm through my blouse. I felt it in the way I walked, slower, more conscious of how my body moved through space. As if the air around me had changed and was now aware of me in a way it hadn't been before. At breakfast, I placed a plate in front of him, my husband, and he thanked me without lifting his eyes from his phone. I watched the rhythm of his fingers typing, the slight frown that had become permanent above his nose bridge. He was reading about lawn maintenance. Again. I sipped my coffee slowly, as if holding on to something warmer than the room. And then, he mentioned it. "I was thinking we could go to the cabin this weekend. Just get away from everything for a few days." My spoon froze midair. "We?" He nodded. "You, me, and him, of course. It'll be good for everyone. Change of scenery. Get some real air in our lungs." I glanced across the table. He wasn't there, but I felt his absence like a pulse. The idea of being away, alone in the countryside, in a place with fewer doors and more silence, it wasn't fear that I felt. It was anticipation, laced with shame. "I suppose it might be nice," I murmured. And so the plan was made. We left Friday morning. The car ride was quiet, punctuated by small talk and the occasional joke from my husband, who was trying harder than usual to be engaging. I sat in the front passenger seat, aware of the presence behind me. Not oppressive, but magnetic. Every time we stopped at a light, I imagined his gaze on the back of my neck. When I leaned forward to adjust the radio, I could feel his eyes follow the curve of my spine. It was unbearable. It was addictive. We reached the cabin by late afternoon. It wasn't far, just a modest wooden house nestled among pine trees, the kind of place where cell reception disappears and you can hear the wind talking through the leaves. I had always liked it here. Now, the silence felt more dangerous. The men carried the bags while I opened windows and swept away the dust of disuse. The air smelled of pine and damp wood. Familiar, but now charged with something new. I watched him move, how he carried the suitcase with one hand, the quiet confidence in his steps. He didn't speak much, but his silence felt louder than words. That evening we sat on the porch, the three of us. The sunset was modest, a wash of color barely touching the sky. My husband poured wine, joked about old trips, told a story I had heard a dozen times. I laughed at the right moments, nodded when needed. But I was aware, painfully aware of how close he sat. Not touching me, not even looking directly at me, but our knees almost brushed. My skin was tuned to his proximity. Every movement he made pulled my attention like a tide. My husband excused himself around 9, complaining of a headache. He kissed the top of my head and disappeared inside, leaving us alone on the porch. I didn't look at him right away. I let the silence settle between us, thick and dense. "You knew he'd go to bed early," I said eventually. He didn't answer immediately. Then, I hoped. I turned my face toward him. The porch light carved shadows along his cheekbone, making him look older, more resolute. "This isn't a game," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Number, it's not." "Then what is it?" He looked at me, truly looked. "It's something neither of us planned, but we're in it now." His words struck me like a hand across still water. I had expected deflection, hesitation, maybe even apology. But this quiet honesty, it left no room to pretend. I swallowed hard. "And what are we supposed to do with it?" "I don't know, but I can't pretend it's not happening. Can you?" I didn't answer, because I couldn't. We sat in silence again, not because we had nothing to say, but because words would only clutter what we already understood. I stared out into the darkening woods, the trees swaying like secrets being passed through branches. When I finally stood to go inside, I felt his eyes follow me, not with possession, not even desire, but with something deeper. A knowing, a longing that mirrored mine. Upstairs, the guest room light glowed under the door as I passed. I hesitated. For a second, just one, I wanted to knock. I wanted to open the door and let everything unravel. But I didn't. Instead, I slipped into our room, into the bed I'd shared for years. My husband was asleep already, his breathing even, his hand curled near his face like a child's. I watched him for a long time. He looked peaceful, trusting. I lay down slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet. But inside me, the storm had already begun. I woke before the others. The cabin was still cloaked in that gray-blue pre-dawn hue, when light barely touches the world and everything feels suspended, waiting. I sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the slow breath of my husband as he lay behind me, unaware. My feet found the cold floor, and I moved quietly, wrapping a cardigan around my shoulders before stepping out into the hallway. The wood beneath my feet creaked in that familiar way, like it remembered every step I had ever taken here. I passed the guest room. The door was closed, but I paused in front of it, staring at the thin line of shadow beneath. There was no light, no sound, but I felt him inside. More accurately, I felt the imprint he had already begun to leave on me. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of old pine and dust. I opened a window to let in the crisp morning air, then filled the kettle and waited, staring at the trees outside. They swayed gently, moving in rhythm with a world I no longer felt entirely part of. Something had shifted. Not with violence, not even with clarity, but with the slow certainty of water carving stone. He came down a little later, his hair damp from a quick shower, his steps light, but sure. He didn't say good morning. He just walked to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and leaned against the counter opposite me. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was thick with everything we weren't saying. He watched me for a moment, then spoke. "I've been thinking about leaving the cabin early." My stomach turned unexpectedly. "Why?" "I thought it might make things easier." I met his eyes. "For whom?" He didn't answer right away. "For you." There was a weight to those words, not because they were noble, but because they were honest. He wasn't trying to manipulate or dramatize. He was offering me a way out. But I didn't want out. "Don't," I said quietly. "Stay." His face didn't change much, but I saw the tension ease slightly in his shoulders. And just like that, we crossed another line. Not with our bodies, not yet, but with our choices. Later that morning, my husband suggested a drive into town. "We needed groceries," he said. "Some fresh fruit, maybe bread from that little bakery we liked." I was about to stand when he looked at me and added, "Why don't you go with him? I'll stay and finish fixing that window in the back." I froze for a moment. It felt like a trap, even though it wasn't. His tone was casual, friendly, but the offer, it felt like a test I hadn't prepared for. He looked up at me, smiling. "It'll be nice for you two to catch up. He doesn't talk much to me." I glanced across the room. His son looked at me, unreadable. "Sure," I said, forcing my voice to sound easy. "We'll go." The car ride was quiet at first. We drove through the winding forest roads, windows slightly cracked, the scent of damp earth and pine filling the space between us. I watched the way the light moved across his profile, how his fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel in sync with the low music playing from the radio. "You don't have to say anything," he said eventually, eyes on the road. "I wasn't planning to," I replied. But I was. I turned to face him fully. "You make me feel like I've woken up after years of sleep." He tightened his grip on the wheel, just slightly. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," I said, "but I want to give something, even if it's just this moment." He pulled into a small gas station on the edge of town. It had a cracked sign and a single pump. We sat there for a moment before he killed the engine. "We don't have to go in," he said. I shook my head. "Number, let's go." Inside, everything felt surreal. The harsh fluorescent lights, the quiet buzz of the refrigerator, a man at the counter reading a newspaper. And us, two people walking the narrow aisles pretending to look for cereal, while every nerve in my body screamed from his nearness. He reached for something on a high shelf. Orange juice, maybe. And his arm brushed mine. Not by accident. Not anymore. I turned my head slowly and our eyes met. It was electric, the kind of pull that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know how to stop wanting this," I whispered. "I don't think you do," he replied, just as quietly. Back in the car, the mood had changed. There was something heavier now, something unspoken but clear. This was no longer about what we might do. It was about what we would do, eventually. We stopped at the bakery. I picked up a loaf of sourdough, still warm in the paper bag. He chose a small box of pastries. As we waited in line, he leaned slightly closer. "You've got flour on your cheek," he said, reaching out. His thumb brushed just below my cheekbone. The touch was so gentle it felt almost imagined. But it wasn't. My breath caught. Outside, it had started to rain again. Not heavily, just enough to coat the windshield in glistening specks. He opened the door for me, and when I slid in, my skirt caught on the seat. He leaned in to adjust it, his hand grazing my knee. The touch lingered, and I didn't move away. "I shouldn't want you like this," he said, voice low, still leaning close. "But you do," he exhaled. "And you?" I turned to him, close enough to feel his breath. "Yes." The kiss came then. Slow at first, tentative. But when our lips met, something ignited. It wasn't soft or hesitant like the one in the garden. This was a kiss with purpose, with hunger built from restraint. My fingers found the side of his neck. His hand slid behind my head. The car disappeared. The rain disappeared. Everything outside the heat of his mouth against mine ceased to exist. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. We both pulled back, breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine. "We should go," he murmured. I nodded. We should. But neither of us moved for a while. When we returned to the cabin, my husband was still outside, hammering something into place. He looked up, smiling, wiping sweat from his brow. I waved. The bag of bread was still warm in my hands, and the kiss was still burning on my lips. Later, as I unpacked groceries, I caught my reflection in the window. My cheeks were flushed, my eyes too bright. I looked like a woman on the edge of something she couldn't undo, and I didn't want to undo it. The next morning brought with it a tension so thick I could feel it pulsing in the walls. Even the light that poured through the cabin windows felt heavier, more deliberate, as though it had witnessed something it couldn't unsee. I moved through the kitchen slowly, almost cautiously, my fingertips trailing the edges of countertops as if trying to steady myself. The pastries from the day before sat untouched on the counter. I ran a hand through my hair, suddenly aware of how tangled it had become. Everything inside me felt disheveled, raw. I had barely slept, my thoughts tangled in the memory of the kiss. His hand against my thigh, the warmth of his breath against my skin, the impossible closeness of our bodies in that tiny car. It had been more than a kiss. It had been a shift, something irreversible. My husband appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, his hair still wet from a quick shower, a towel thrown haphazardly over his shoulder. "Thinking we might head back tomorrow," he said casually, reaching for the coffee pot. "Supposed to rain all next week, and I've got meetings piling up." I nodded, pretending to consider the idea. "Probably for the best." He kissed the top of my head without looking at me, the way you might pat a dog out of routine. I smiled faintly, but it didn't reach my eyes. He didn't notice. Later that afternoon, he suggested a walk around the lake. I made an excuse, said I had laundry to finish, that my knee was acting up, anything to avoid the closeness I once craved but now found unbearable. He shrugged and left without protest, his boots thudding softly against the porch steps. The moment the door shut behind him, the air changed. I stood in the center of the living room, every part of me alert. I didn't have to wait long. I heard the soft creak of the stairs before I saw him. He walked slowly, his eyes locked on mine from the first step. There was no pretense, no avoidance. Just the steady inevitability of what was about to happen. We stood facing each other, the room suddenly too small to contain what had been building for days. "I thought you were leaving," I whispered. "I was," he said. "Then I saw you this morning, and I knew I couldn't." He took a step closer. "This is wrong," I said. He nodded. "I know." But neither of us moved away. Another step and another. When he finally reached me, he didn't touch me right away. He just looked, really looked, as if memorizing every detail, my breath, my hesitation, the slight tremble in my fingers. And then his hand reached for mine. Our fingers laced together like they'd been doing it all our lives. The kiss came again, but this time it was different. It was slower, deeper, filled with everything we hadn't dared say. His lips moved over mine with such intention, such aching restraint, that my knees nearly gave out. I held onto his shirt, pulling him closer, grounding myself in the weight of him. His hand moved to my back, warm and steady. My body responded before thought could catch up. Every nerve in me screamed for more, and yet we both stayed exactly where we were, frozen in that unbearable in-between. Still clothed, still careful, but already far past the line we were pretending hadn't been crossed. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against his chest, my breath ragged. "This won't end well," I murmured. "I know," he said again, "but I don't want it to stop." He exhaled, his hand finding the back of my neck. "Neither do I." We stood like that for a long time, our bodies pressed together, hearts pounding out two separate rhythms, trying desperately to become one. There was no lust in it. Not the kind people whisper about when they talk of betrayal. It was intimacy. Hunger, yes, but layered with something more complicated, more dangerous. When I heard the distant crunch of gravel, the unmistakable sound of boots on the path, I pulled away. Too quickly. My pulse raced, heat rising in my chest. He stepped back, his face unreadable, his jaw clenched. I rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a dish towel, trying to look busy. By the time my husband walked in, shaking raindrops from his jacket, we were in opposite corners of the room, as if nothing had happened. As if everything hadn't. He looked between us, then smiled. "Missed the worst of it," he said cheerfully. "You two should take a walk before the next wave hits." I nodded numbly, my throat dry. That evening, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, unsure of what I was doing. My hands moved on instinct, selecting a soft cream blouse that clung to my body just enough to be noticed. Underneath, I chose the red lace bra I hadn't worn in years. It was delicate, sensual, and wholly inappropriate for a cabin in the woods. But I wore it anyway. I wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to be seen, wanted to reclaim something I hadn't realized I'd lost until it found me in another man's gaze. When I stepped out into the hallway, he was there. Leaning against the wall, arms crossed, as if he'd been waiting for me. His eyes dropped to the curve of my waist, the slope of my collarbone. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. We didn't touch. Not that night. Not again. But every movement we made around each other, every glance, every brush of an elbow, every moment spent in the same room, was charged, deliberate. At dinner, we laughed at my husband's story about their road trip years ago. I passed the salt. He passed the wine. Our fingers never met, but the space between them vibrated. Later, as I lay in bed next to a man who believed he knew me, who loved me in the only way he knew how, I realized something unbearable. I no longer knew who I was when I wasn't being seen by someone else. Not loved. Not needed. Just seen. I turned onto my side, away from my husband, my eyes burning. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Because I knew I would choose it again. The kiss, the risk, the ache of wanting something that wasn't mine to want. And I knew, with a clarity that frightened me, that this wasn't over. It was only deepening. The rain fell heavily the next morning, rhythmic and ceaseless, like a metronome ticking time that no longer belonged to me. I stood by the kitchen window, the fog outside pressing against the glass like something alive. Inside, everything felt still. Too still. As if the house itself was holding its breath. My husband had gone into town alone this time, said he needed nails, something for the pipes, and I hadn't asked questions. I simply nodded, grateful for the solitude even though it frightened me. I could feel him before I saw him. That familiar shift in the air, the quiet presence that had become more intoxicating than words. I didn't turn around when he stepped into the kitchen, but I knew he was standing behind me. I could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle gravity that pulled at me every time he was near. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. I shook my head. "No." "Me neither." His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the edge in it, the tension lying just beneath the surface. I turned around slowly, and there he was, barefoot, shirt wrinkled, hair damp from the shower. His eyes found mine immediately, and in them I saw the same exhaustion I felt, the same hunger, the same restraint. He didn't move closer. Not yet. But he didn't need to. The space between us was already shrinking, not in distance, but in denial. "I thought about you all night," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said. I could feel it. There was something terrifying about how easily we could say these things now, as if the wall had finally cracked wide enough to let the truth spill out. I stepped past him, toward the counter, pretending to busy myself with nothing. My hands trembled slightly as I rearranged a stack of napkins that didn't need rearranging. Behind me, he spoke again. "Are you afraid?" I turned my head. "Of what?" "That this isn't temporary." I met his gaze. "I'm afraid it's not." He walked toward me slowly, deliberately, and I didn't move. When he reached me, he didn't touch me. He just stood close enough that I could smell the soap on his skin, feel the heat radiating from him like a current. "We're not careful anymore," I said. "No," he agreed. "And yet I don't want to be." His hand reached out then, not for my waist, not for my hand, but for my wrist. His fingers brushed the inside of it, barely touching, tracing the line of a vein that pulsed beneath the skin. My breath caught. He leaned forward, not to kiss me, but to rest his forehead against mine. It was the most intimate gesture I'd felt in years. No urgency, no expectation, just closeness, connection. "I've never done this before," he murmured. "I don't know how to be in this." "Neither do I whispered back. "But I'm already in it." We stayed like that for a moment longer, then pulled apart. There was nothing more to say. Not then. The words would only have diminished what was already screaming between us without sound. He moved to the door. "I'm going to the garage. The bike needs a new chain." I nodded. "Okay." After he left, I stood still for a long time, hand pressed to my chest, trying to slow the pounding rhythm beneath it. Then I went upstairs, pulled open the drawer where I kept the things I never wore anymore, and chose a black satin camisole with thin straps and lace along the neckline. It was too elegant for a rainy day, too revealing for a house with 3 adults. But I put it on anyway. Over it, I slipped on a soft cardigan, left unbuttoned. Casual, but not careless. The garage was cold, dusty, the kind of place where secrets didn't belong. And yet here we were. He was bent over the bike, hands stained with grease, jaw tight in concentration. He looked up when I entered, his eyes scanning me quickly, catching the exposed collarbone, the soft gleam of fabric. "I thought you hated the garage," he said. "I do." "So why are you here?" "Because you are." He exhaled, wiping his hands on a rag. There was a pause, just long enough to allow doubt to slip in. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides and stood in front of me, not touching, just breathing. "You're going to undo me," he said. "Then let it happen." He looked at me like he was seeing something sacred and forbidden at the same time. His hand reached out, fingertips brushing a lock of hair from my cheek. I closed my eyes. The room was silent, but for the rain hammering the roof and the sound of our breaths slowly falling into rhythm. He leaned in, and for a second, I thought we might cross the line we'd danced around so carefully. But instead, he kissed my temple. Light. Tender. Almost reverent. It hurt more than it soothed. Then he stepped back. "We should go inside." "I know." But we didn't move. At dinner that evening, everything returned to normal. My husband laughed at the state of the old plumbing, joked that we should finally replace the porch swing that groaned every time someone sat on it. I nodded, refilled glasses, passed dishes. The performance was perfect, seamless, and yet beneath the surface I felt like I was vibrating, a live wire hidden beneath polished floors. He didn't look at me during the meal, not directly, but once when our hands reached for the same dish, his fingers brushed mine just long enough for me to feel the message in it. "I see you. I remember." That night, I climbed into bed wearing the same satin camisole, letting the cool fabric whisper against my skin. My husband noticed. He smiled. "You look nice." "Thank you." He reached for me then, fingers sliding along my arm, his touch warm but unfamiliar. I let him. I turned toward him. I kissed him. I let the motions happen, the choreography of intimacy long memorized. But I wasn't in it. Not fully. I was somewhere else. Remembering the way another hand had touched my wrist. The way another mouth had lingered near my skin without taking anything. The way I had felt wanted for who I was, not what I had always been. When it was over, he curled against me, satisfied and content. I stared at the ceiling, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. Not from guilt, but from clarity. I was living 2 lives now. And the terrifying thing was, I didn't want to give either of them up. I wanted both the comfort and the fire. I wanted the man who had known me for years and the one who had seen me for the first time only weeks ago. And I knew. I couldn't have both forever. But for now, I wasn't ready to let go. We left the cabin the next day. The car ride was quiet. The kind of silence that isn't comfortable but necessary. Like wrapping gauze around a wound that hasn't yet bled. My husband drove, humming occasionally to the country station he always listened to on road trips. I sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in my lap, watching the trees blur into open fields. Behind me, he sat quietly, barely moving. But I felt him. The way I could feel a storm approaching before the sky darkened. My husband spoke now and then, about the color of the leaves, how the chimney probably needed cleaning before winter, about booking a long weekend later in the year. I nodded, said the right things, smiled at the right moments. But inside, I was somewhere else entirely. I kept pressing my fingers lightly to my lips as though the memory of his kiss still lived there, as though I could summon it with just the right pressure. That kiss had undone something in me. Not in the way of passion or recklessness, but in the way an old door creaks open after years of being sealed shut. It had let light into places I had forgotten existed. When we got home, everything returned to its usual rhythm frighteningly fast. My husband unpacked, started laundry, commented on how dry the garden had become. I moved through the house like I was inside a dream. Everything looked the same, felt the same, but nothing was. He disappeared upstairs shortly after dinner, claiming to be tired. And he and I, drifted to opposite sides of the living room, avoiding each other's eyes like criminals at a wake. He didn't join us for dinner the next evening, said he wasn't hungry. My husband barely noticed. I did. I felt it in the quiet weight of the chair he didn't occupy, in the shadowed part of the room that seemed darker without him there. That night, in bed, I lay beside my husband as he watched something on his laptop, the screen casting cold light across his face. I turned away, pressing my cheek to the pillow, my heart beating with the dull ache of something left unfinished. I stared into the dark for what felt like hours, imagining the soft rustle of sheets in the guest room, the way he might be lying awake too, staring at the ceiling, thinking of me. I woke early the next morning, earlier than usual. The house was still and quiet. I chose my clothes carefully, dark jeans that fit just right, a fitted black turtleneck, subtle makeup that gave me color without drawing attention. My reflection stared back at me with unreadable eyes that had learned to hide, eyes that didn't belong to the woman I used to be. He came downstairs not long after. He paused when he saw me but said nothing, just nodded. We existed in parallel now, separate but impossibly entangled. I'm heading to the store, I told my husband casually. We're out of a few things. Take him with you, he said without looking up from the paper. No sense in you going alone. I froze. Just for a second. He didn't notice, or maybe he did. Sure, he said before I could respond. Happy to. The drive was short, but it felt long. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full, swollen with everything we hadn't dared speak since the kiss in the car. I didn't look at him, but I felt him. Every movement, every breath. We walked through the grocery store like strangers, talking only about vegetables and prices. I picked up onions. He grabbed bread. We moved through aisles like actors in a scene we hadn't rehearsed. But it was on the pasta aisle of all places that something cracked open again. You always look like this, he said quietly, eyes scanning a box on the shelf. Held together, like there's a storm inside you and you're the only one who knows it's there. I turned to him. You think this is easy for me? Number, I think it's killing you. And I think you're tired of pretending it's not. I'm not pretending, I whispered. I'm surviving. He took a step closer. And what happens when surviving isn't enough? I didn't answer. I couldn't. He reached for my hand, not boldly, not with intention to claim, but simply to feel. Our fingers barely touched. But in that second, the world narrowed. The shelves, the fluorescent lights, the quiet hum of the store, all of it blurred. Outside, as we loaded the groceries into the trunk, neither of us spoke. He closed the door gently, and then we stood there, side by side in the parking lot, as if waiting for something to decide our next move. We were driving past a storefront on the way back when I saw it, reflected in the glass of a furniture store window. The two of us, captured like a still from a film. Me, turned slightly toward him. Him, watching me. Nothing more. But it said everything. Later that evening, my husband brought it up. Were you two near the furniture store on Main? He asked over dinner. I hesitated. Why? I thought I saw you. Reflected in the window. Could have been someone else. He didn't look up as he said it. His voice was calm, steady, but I felt the shift in temperature, like a draft entering a sealed room. "No," I said carefully. "We didn't go near there." He nodded, said nothing more, but the silence afterward was different. Watching, measuring. When I looked up, his eyes were on his plate, but his fingers had stopped moving. And I knew the ground was beginning to move beneath us. We were no longer hidden. Not really. The photo didn't exist, at least not as far as I knew. No picture had been taken. No proof had been offered. But the image in the reflection, the one my husband thought he saw, settled in the house like dust, invisible but everywhere. I could feel it in the pauses between his sentences, in the way he held his coffee mug a second too long before drinking, in how his eyes lingered on mine, then moved away just before I could read them. He didn't mention it again, not directly. But the following morning, he was up earlier than usual, dressed before I'd even stirred under the covers. He made breakfast without asking if I wanted any, left the toast to burn slightly, and stirred his coffee with mechanical precision. He kissed me goodbye with dry lips and said he had errands to run. I sat at the kitchen table long after he left, staring at the toast I wouldn't eat, the empty chair across from me. And then I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway, still in his t-shirt from the night before, bare feet on the hardwood, hair damp from a recent shower. "I thought you left," I said quietly. "I stayed." He walked into the kitchen, took the seat my husband had just vacated, and leaned forward, his arms resting on the table. "He suspects something." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't need to. "Yes," I said. "I think he does." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a bird called once, then again, as if trying to fill the space we left empty. "I should leave," he said. I didn't answer. "Not because I want to," he added, "but because if I stay, we'll make this worse." "You mean real?" He looked at me. "It's already real." That hit something inside me I wasn't prepared for. Because it was true. This wasn't a flirtation. It wasn't a game. It was real. And real things have weight. Real things leave consequences. "I don't want you to go," I said. "I know," he whispered. "That's why I haven't." I looked down at my hands, tracing the edge of my thumbnail with the tip of another. My hands looked foreign to me now. Older, frailer. Not the hands of a woman who once believed she had control. He stood up slowly, walked around the table, and knelt beside my chair. His hand reached up and touched my arm, then slid down to my wrist, his thumb resting on the pulse he'd memorized. "Say the word," he said, "and I'll go." But I didn't. I couldn't. That afternoon, my husband sent a message. "Stuck in traffic. We'll be late. Don't wait for me." I read it twice, then slid the phone into my back pocket. My fingers trembled as I reached for the kettle. I boiled water. I washed a mug. I wiped down the already clean counter. I changed my shirt. I brushed my hair. I wanted to pretend I was calm. I wasn't. When I walked into the living room, he was already there, sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked up when I entered and stood quickly, uncertain. "Are you sure?" he asked. I didn't speak. I walked to him slowly, as though each step confirmed something I could no longer deny. When I stopped in front of him, I reached for his hand. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." But we didn't touch, not in the way we could have. Instead, we stood in that fragile stillness, eyes locked, breath shared. He reached up, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and then his fingers lingered on my cheek. "You're shaking," he said softly. "I know. Do you want to stop?" "No." His hand moved to my waist, tentative, then firm. I leaned into him, and we stood there, not kissing, not moving, just being. Two people wrapped in something neither of them fully understood, but both of them completely surrendered to. Eventually, he pulled back. "I need to leave," he said. "Soon." I nodded, even as my body screamed against it. "But I'll come back." "Why?" Because I don't think I can stay away. He stepped back. I watched him go up the stairs, heard the door to his room close with unbearable softness. That night, I cooked dinner for two. I sat at the table alone, slicing meat that had gone cold, sipping wine I didn't want. The house was too quiet. Every sound, the refrigerator hum, the ticking clock, the occasional creak of settling wood felt amplified. When my husband came home, he smiled tiredly and kissed my cheek. He asked how my day was. I lied. He asked if there was more wine. I poured it. We sat on the couch together, his arm draped casually over the back. I leaned into it, like a role I knew too well. But later, as I lay in bed, his hand brushing absent-mindedly over my hip, I closed my eyes and thought about a wrist, a breath. The way someone said, "Stay," without speaking. And when I heard a door open down the hall, quiet, careful, I didn't move. I just listened. And I knew he wasn't gone yet. Not really. The next morning arrived without ceremony. The sun filtered through the blinds in that pale, disinterested way it often did during early fall. Neither warm nor cold, just light for the sake of it. I sat at the kitchen table alone, stirring my tea until it had gone lukewarm, letting the spoon tap gently against the porcelain like a clock ticking down to something I couldn't name. He was leaving. I didn't need him to say it. I felt it in the way he avoided my gaze at breakfast, in how he lingered near the stairs with his coffee half full and his shoulders drawn tight. Even in how he walked, measured, deliberate, like someone rehearsing goodbye in every step. My husband had already left for work. His plate, wiped clean of eggs and toast, sat on the counter where I'd set it hours earlier. He had kissed me on the cheek and mumbled something about a late meeting, then disappeared out the door in his usual rhythm. I had nodded, smiled, leaned into the kiss just enough to pass as present. But I wasn't. Not fully. I was watching him, still in the house, his bag half-zipped at the foot of the stairs. I hadn't asked where he was going. I hadn't needed to. When something ends, it doesn't need explanation. The silence becomes answer enough. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen like a shadow, a quiet shape against the morning. "I'll be gone a while," he said simply. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I didn't ask how long a while meant. "I thought maybe it would be better," he added. "For everyone." Still, I said nothing. He placed his mug in the sink with a soft clink and looked at me. Really looked. I could feel the words collecting in his throat. Ones he wouldn't say, couldn't say. Because the moment for them had passed. Instead, he offered the smallest smile, that same quiet curve of the mouth I'd memorized without meaning to. "I'll come back," he said. "When?" I whispered. He shrugged, helpless. "When it makes sense." We stood like that for a beat too long. Then he turned, grabbed his bag, and disappeared down the hall. I didn't follow. I listened to the door open, then close. I listened to the silence that followed, the kind that fills every inch of a space, making it feel too large and too tight all at once. I didn't cry. Instead, I moved mechanically, washed the mug he left behind, folded the dish towel, wiped down the already clean counters. I tried to fit myself back into the shape of the life I had before he came, but I couldn't remember what that shape had been. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I wandered from room to room, starting tasks I didn't finish, sorting laundry, watering plants, opening the fridge and forgetting why. I sat on the edge of the bed we shared and stared at the place where his keys used to rest on the dresser. It was empty now, but I could still see them. That evening, I made dinner. I chopped vegetables with more force than necessary, the knife rhythmic against the board. My husband arrived later than usual. He looked tired. His tie was crooked, his hair slightly mussed. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day. I told him it was quiet. We ate together. He told me about a colleague's retirement party, about the printer breaking down again, about a strange email from a supplier. I nodded, made the appropriate sounds, asked one or two questions. My face moved, my voice responded, but my mind was elsewhere, retracing conversations that never finished, touches that had ended too soon. Rooms that had once been filled with breath and tension and something that felt dangerously like belonging. After dinner, he poured himself a drink and settled into the couch with a newspaper. I stood at the sink, scrubbing the same plate for too long. My reflection in the dark window was faint but undeniable. I didn't look like a woman recovering from an affair. I looked like someone waiting for it to start again. Later, in bed, I lay awake. The ceiling above me seemed taller, more distant, like a sky I could never touch. My husband slept beside me, his arm flung carelessly over his pillow, his mouth slightly open. I listened to the sound of his breathing and wondered how I'd gone so long thinking it was enough. I turned on my side, away from him, and closed my eyes. But my mind pulled me elsewhere, into a different room, with different light, a different voice whispering things no one else had ever said to me. I remembered the weight of his hand on my back, the way he'd memorized the rhythm of my breath, the silence between us that had always said more than words. I wondered if he was thinking of me. If he was lying in someone else's guest room now, staring at someone else's ceiling, remembering the way my fingers had trembled when they touched his. I wondered if the distance we'd created was enough to kill what had been between us, or if it would smolder quietly, waiting for the next time. The house felt colder without him. Not empty. My husband was still here. The walls still held laughter and footsteps and the smell of laundry detergent. But colder. Like something vital had slipped through the cracks and no one had noticed but me. In the following days, life continued. The dishes piled and were cleaned. The mail came. Appointments were made and kept. I smiled when I needed to. I answered phone calls. I ironed shirts. But underneath it all, something in me stayed tilted, just a few degrees off balance, enough to make the world feel slightly askew. A week later, I found the photograph. It was in my phone gallery, buried between screenshots and recipes. A picture I hadn't taken deliberately. I'd been testing the front-facing camera in the car, checking my hair in the reflection of the screen, and it had snapped without me realizing. And there we were, in the background, in the glass of a storefront, just as my husband had said. His eyes on me. My lips parted in response. No contact. No touch. But the image told the whole story. I stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, I deleted it. That night, we had dinner with friends. I laughed at the right moments, complimented the wine, asked about their daughter's new job. I was charming, attentive. No one suspected a thing. But when we got home and the house finally fell quiet, I stood in front of the mirror in our bathroom and studied my face. I didn't look different, but I was. I turned off the light and walked back to bed, slipping under the covers beside a man who loved me in a way that once felt like everything. And still, I dreamed of someone who had seen me, touched me, and walked away. But not for long, because somewhere in me I knew he would return, and I would let him in.